In the days leading up to Elden Ring's initial release, me and the homie iBootyJuice were consistently claiming that it would be garbage, and would never live up to the hype. We were fully under the impression that FromSoft had bitten off more than they could chew, and that their new approach to game design would be a misguided mess. Not being familiar with the crafting system, I had assumed that it would be intrusive to the main experience of the game, and after seeing stealth utilized in a promotional preview, I thought it would be too powerful to be balanced appropriately. And I thought the same of Spirit Summons. However, within an hour of gameplay, both me and iBootyJuice were completely hooked. The game released at 10 PM in our local time, and we were going in with the assumption that we would be attempting the first boss a couple of times and then calling it a night. And yet, me and Booty didn't put the game down until 3 in the morning. And strangely, we both independently happened to wake up and begin playing once again at 6 in the morning. The massive scale, interesting art direction, intrigue built through NPC dialogue, and unbridled call to adventure that saturated throughout Elden Ring's early moments had developed a manic excitement in us that couldn't be contained by the need for sleep. For me, this excitement lasted weeks upon weeks as I scoured the game for all of its content, yet still missing out on bits of the game that I wouldn't see for up to 2 years later. And after no-hitting every boss, seeing every location for the most part, every NPC quest for the most part, and eventually no-hitting the whole game 4 months later, I had no choice but to deem this masterpiece as the greatest game I've ever played. From the lowest lows of the Godskin duo to the highest highs of Malekith, Morgott, Hoarah, and Mohg, this game was a roller coaster of investment, wonder, difficulty, and most of all, adventure. And it was accessible to more people than ever, offering a delightful experience exploring through the game, potentially to gather various pieces of overpowered equipment, which could see the more casual side of the fanbase through the more difficult checkpoints of progression. But it also offered intense difficulty through the endgame bosses, many of which are considered the hardest in all of Souls. At the end of the day, there is only one word to most accurately describe Elden Ring. It is a masterpiece, and I've spent the last 2 years wanting one thing more than anything else in the world: more Elden Ring. FromSoft's DLCs are widely known to be their best content for a variety of reasons, and the idea that Elden Ring would someday be receiving that treatment left my mouth watering. So let's take a look at what we should have expected from an Elden Ring DLC. Firstly, there's Refinement. FromSoft has an unmatched reputation for their DLCs taking what worked about the main game's content and then refining that into its most perfect form. For me, the most poignant example of this is Bloodborne, which toys with mechanics like limb crippling throughout the main game but never really seems to meet the mark in the base content. Crippleable bosses are most often comboed from one cripple into the next until the boss's health bar is drained, which is pretty underwhelming and reduces the boss to a sad, pathetic punching bag. The DLC of Bloodborne instead finds a reasonable balance between cripple staggers being useful for bits of extra damage without them overshadowing the boss entirely. Ludwig, for example, is crippleable, but you wouldn't really even have to consider that at all while fighting him. You'll be too busy worrying about the dangerous, powerful boss fight in front of you to care about a single hit of extra damage. As for Elden Ring, the mechanics that I think have the most potential for refinement would be jumpable moves, minor dungeons, stealth, and exploration. And not because these aspects need to be refined further, but more so that they could be implemented in more ways, especially jumpable moves. I think the jumpability of boss attacks was criminally underused in the main game, especially being that it increases the skill ceiling of learning a boss's moveset. Hoarah is about the only main fight that appropriately implements this feature, and he stands out in such a unique way for it. Now, one thing that seems to be a prominent idea within FromSoft's DLCs is their increase in difficulty, which I would consider an aspect of refinement more so than a focus on difficulty itself. Soulsborne DLCs will generally only be accessible from the endgame or after beating a final boss, which sets them to be balanced against the game's soft and hard stat caps in a simple way. The DLC bosses are usually not going to be pushovers health-wise, and due to that, they have to have fully fleshed out and complex movesets. Their difficulty comes from pitting you against an enemy that, best case scenario, you'll still have to deal with for a good chunk of time, while avoiding a complex moveset with a diverse assortment of timings and AoEs that you'll have to mentally account for and time well in the moment while utilizing good positioning skills. In short, a so-called difficult DLC boss is just a well-designed boss with a big enough health bar to justify its position in the endgame. Just as, ideally, an easy boss would be a well-designed boss with a small health bar positioned in the early game. such as Margit. This point will be relevant to my analysis soon enough, so keep it in mind. So what else should we have expected from an Elden Ring DLC? Well, in a perfect world, the DLC would find a way to recapture the excitement of the explorative aspects of Elden Ring, either through offering so much new and useful loot and fresh challenges littered throughout the world that you'll naturally be inclined to explore, or by piggybacking off of the base game, and offering a synergy between the lands between and the realm of Shadow that would allow easy access between realms. This would offer you an enriched new game run of Elden Ring and allow you to plan the run of your playthrough that weaves through the new and old content, picking up items and abilities in one of the areas that would enhance your experience through the other, creating a synergy between them. Unfortunately, we knew going in that the DLC would require beating Moog, which, sure, can be done early enough, but odds are you're going to have a full build before entering the DLC. So our only hope is that the DLC's exploration can stand on its own. Another aspect we should expect from the DLC is an immense replayability. I've played Elden Ring over 100 times through, and I can't say I've quite gotten bored of it yet. There's always a new challenge run to try or a new weapon to start a playthrough with. It would be hard to imagine a FromSoft DLC that lacks replayability. And lastly, I expect the DLC to feature fantastic lore. This game is filled to the brim with unanswered questions and unfinished plot points, and who wouldn't expect the DLC to regale us with fresh stories that enrich the main lore of the lands between? And so that's what I expected going into this DLC, and I don't think that I was necessarily overestimating what FromSoft could deliver. They've yet to let me down in their modern games, and my personal philosophy about their game design is that they keep getting better and better. And that's not to mention the 2.5 years that it took to deliver this content. So let's take a look at what we got. This DLC was so bad, it made me touch grass. And I'm not even joking when I say that. I took a week off work to play this content, hoping to cram as much game time as possible into that period before financial obligations forced me away. I waited till 10 PM when the DLC released, fully planning on playing all night. Yet instead, I played for a couple of hours, tried Relana for a bit, and then called it a night. I slept in, returned to the game, beat Relana, and then took on the Tower of Ballarat area. And after realizing that this boss feels like absolute shit, featuring such a simplistic design that telegraphs could only be unnatural and frustrating, I took a break, made lunch, and then sat outside in the sun. The contrast of Elden Ring's original release filling me with such a manic excitement that I couldn't put it down, and this content, which I had to force myself to play, left me in such a state of depression over the last couple weeks. And sure, you could make the argument that I had set my expectations too high, but this is Elden Ring we're talking about. I love this game, even its shittiest parts. And so I'm left with the conclusion that this content isn't Elden Ring. It's something else. Something worse. And why is that? Well, let's start with difficulty. It is no secret that FromSoft was attempting to up the ante with the content in Shadow of the Erdtree's difficulty. And in hindsight, that concept just seems so juvenile and such a misread of what Elden Ring was meant to be. As I've discussed before in my Elden Ring analysis videos, Elden Ring is both the hardest and easiest Souls game, all depending on how meta your build is and how much time you want to put into it. Almost every single boss and mini-boss in Elden Ring is much more complex than any boss in prior games, which means a low damage build will make even a mini-boss a difficult challenge to overcome. As well as that, you're given more freedom than ever to build an overpowered build earlier than ever before, which means even a complex endgame boss can be made incredibly easy. People fucking love this aspect of Elden Ring, especially considering the large influx of more casual players due to Elden Ring's mainstream success. Mimic Tear, Great Shields, Azure Comet, Mogwin's Sacred Spear, Spirit Summons, they're all beloved by a large portion of the fan base specifically because they make the game easier. So why the fuck would the focus of the new content be to make the game more difficult at all costs? Especially so when extremely cheesy overpowered shit is locked behind the DLC. And let me tell you, there was certainly a cost to this design choice. Let's stop beating around the bush here. The final boss of this DLC is one of the most pathetic attempts at artificially inflating the difficulty of a boss that I've ever seen, in an implementation that I've dubbed the waterfowl problem. Now, I've been vocally critical against Millennia's waterfowl move for years now. Long story short, Millennia's waterfowl is undodgeable. And I already know what you're thinking because I've heard it all a million times before. Yes, you can dodge waterfowl by exploiting her tracking. Yes, you can dodge her first burst with Bloodhound Step. Yes, you can subvert the move with an ice pot. What I mean when I say undodgeable is that there was no developer-intended way to dodge this move. There is no way in hell that FromSoft expected players to do a full 360 around her in order to throw the move off, which can only leave us with the conclusion that FromSoft didn't have an answer to Waterfowl while designing it. They simply expected players to find a way around it. Now don't get me wrong, I completely understand that gamers will absolutely find a way around an obstacle no matter what. But designing a move without also having an answer for that move is undoubtedly sloppy craftsmanship, and why I call Millennia an artificially difficult boss. If we allow this kind of design without criticizing it, then we're essentially saying that sloppy, lazy design is the same as difficult design. Taking this concept to its ultimate form, what if there was a boss that filled their arena with an AoE that lasted 5 seconds? And the only answer we came up with was to glitch through the fog wall with a specific Ash of War, wait out the attack, and then glitch back in. Sure, a boss fight that you have to carefully position yourself nearby the fog wall while fighting so as to perform this glitch would be difficult. But if you wouldn't also call it stupid bullshit, then you're not a very serious person. The bottom line for me is that every single move in the game should be avoidable by either dodging, jumping, crouching, or sprinting, the basic abilities your character has, and they should all be designed with developer-intended methods of avoiding in mind. Now you might be able to excuse Waterfowl because technically you can dodge her move with basic abilities through the spin method. However, Redon the Promised Consort is even worse than that, in the most pathetically simple way. Redon has access to a move in his basic moveset that is undodgeable, a roll catch positioned directly after a correctly rolled move. I will not mince my words here. This is fucking stupid design. I feel like I should elaborate. These two swings have nearly perfect tracking. The attack is his fastest move. The second swing has twice the reach of a single roll. The only way to avoid both of these moves is to use exploits. So let's list the ones that don't work. You cannot roll in any specific direction, the tracking is too aggressive. You cannot crouch or jump this move. You cannot Bloodhound step out of this move. You cannot low profile with the Bear Claw, which is the lowest your hitbox can get as far as I'm aware. So what can you do? You can use the blind spot Ash of War available on backhand blades, which is what I utilized in my no-hit. This will only work if you're positioned close enough, so it's not consistent. You can parry it, fair enough. I personally have a soft spot for parrying, but it still comes out incredibly quickly and not everyone is going to want to parry. The last option is to utilize one of the new talismans added in the DLC, which gives you iframes on backsteps. Backstepping is quick enough so that you'll have time to roll the second attack. This is probably the most consistent option, but for one thing, requires knowledge of the talisman itself, which I didn't know existed for a long time, which left me to bash my head against the poor design of this boss for hours upon hours. And again, I highly doubt that this was the developer-intended method to avoid this move. FromSoft's development style seems to have taken on the attitude of just throw enough shit at the players, both good and bad, they'll figure it out. And this argument might make me sound elitist, but when it comes to Souls games, the reason they stand above the rest is because they're supposed to be precise. If you take damage, it's supposed to be your fault for not dodging, not your fault for not knowing a very specific and niche ability exists somewhere in the game. And if the design philosophy has degraded to a point at which players continue to get more and more powerful abilities and bosses get harder and harder to compensate, well, pretty soon Souls games will start to look like some normie shit like Skyrim, where you just wail on an enemy while they wail on you. And that might seem far-fetched, but what have players most often been beating Redon with? A Great Shield and Spear combo. The horseshoe theory has made itself clear here. If you make the boss so difficult, then the standard way to beat them will be to use the easiest method possible. And in turn, the game becomes you and the boss wailing on each other. What a fucking embarrassing joke. And I've only mentioned a single one of his moves. He also has a move that seems to cut through your iframes. Might be a glitch, not sure what that's about. He also has the worst hitbox on a thrust move that I've seen in a while. In his Blood Flame attack, you will be hit by this unless you dodge first, which is pretty sad. It's a thrust move. Mesmer has some pretty aggressive tracking on his thrust moves, and even they're strafable because they're fucking thrust moves. And last but certainly not least, he has a pathetic way of increasing his difficulty in in Phase 2 with these ridiculous AoE follow-ups. I honestly thought that this fight was a sloppy fan-made mod when I first saw it. You know how the Millennia the Unalloyed mod just adds a bunch of holy follow-ups on each of her attacks because it's cheap and easy to copy-paste assets onto each of her existing moves. It's really fucking disappointing that Redon got this treatment in the DLC. He's such an awesome fan-favorite character. Getting hypnotized by a sexy femboy, I can understand that part. But giving Redon a send-off with this bad of a boss fight is really disrespectful and sad. I no-hit every single Remembrance fight in this DLC, and I can say with certainty that some of them are awkward, some of them are annoying, but Redon is the only one that is completely broken. And even with whatever exploit you choose to use to avoid his broken moves, you still need to be able to identify them, which are his fastest moves, and then implement your exploit before you get fucked. The bottom line is, you are not no-hitting Redon without a heavy prescription of Adderall. I only managed to do it after chugging 600 milligrams of caffeine on an empty stomach. And when the dust settles, the fight is over, and you're met with the silence of the end of the Shadow of the Erdtree, you'll realize that your last moments with this content are spent in a lazy, sloppy boss fight. Now before I move on, there's two aspects of this boss fight that are more of an overarching problem with the DLC's design as a whole: camera issues and jumpable moves. First of all, if you're going to design a boss fight with incredibly fast moves and subtle telegraphs, can you at least have the camera system functioning remotely well enough to actually see those telegraphs? There are camera issues throughout this whole DLC, which is incredibly sad considering Elden Ring's base game has almost zero camera issues on even its fastest bosses. It reeks of rushed development that even the basic combat features are this rough around the edges. Redon specifically forces you to learn the fight at a close proximity to him so as to avoid the dumbass holy explosion bonus projectiles. And yet, if Redon is to bend over while you're too close to him, the camera won't catch up by the time he stands up, and his next attack will have a mostly obscured telegraph. I mean, just look how frantic the camera feels in these clips. It can't decide whether or not it wants to look directly up or directly down, and meanwhile, I'm supposed to dodge as though I have accurate visual information and positioning skills when my dodges are being thrown all over the place. Now lastly, I feel as though I should mention that Redon does have a jumpable move, which is the Earth Shatter Stomp, which references Godfrey, who he idolized. However, this fight has absolutely no synergy with jumping in any way. You can jump the Earth Shatter if you want, which might be a smart idea considering the camera is likely to drag you into the lingering part of the attack if you're attempting to dodge past it, but you're not really going to get a jump attack in at that point unless you're using a very fast weapon, and you likely have more pressing issues at that point than a single small hit of damage. The reason that Hoarlu's jumpable attacks are so well designed is that they're punishing if you attempt to roll them, they offer you a reasonable opening for a jump attack, and the upgraded variant in his Phase 1.5 and 2.5, which spans the whole arena, becomes less punishing if you're already used to jumping them, because you'll have trained yourself to engage with the moves through timings rather than simply avoiding the moves with positioning. There is a distinct learning curve which offers you great benefits if you learn to jump these attacks. Copying and pasting the Earth Shatter here offers no more than a reference and doesn't make the fight any better. The other time you'll utilize jumping in this fight is to avoid his gravity meatballs by sprinting and then jumping, which yeets you out of the range of the attack. I would say that this is the most standard version of a jumpable boss move throughout the DLC. On most moves you'll find yourself jumping, it's not in an effort to engage with the boss, it's more so that the move's timing is so tight that your best, or sometimes only odds, involves committing to throwing yourself as far as you can outside of the range of the attack, which I see as, once again, pathetic game design. Like, great job designing bosses that are so hard that my only recourse is to disengage entirely with every ability at my disposal. It really gives a great flow to the combat. Anyway, I'm going to quickly go over all of the Remembrance bosses under this section about difficulty, because they're all cranked up to be as difficult as possible, even when they shouldn't be. Let's start with Rellana. The worst part about Rennala is that she's difficult, but also directly blocking you from the rest of the content in the DLC. Sure, there is a side path which allows you to reach the Blue Flower area and the Skadu Altis without fighting her, but the game is clearly telling you based on its geography that you should really clear Castle Ensis before continuing. And the problem with making Rellana somewhat of a skill check is that she really isn't all that complex once you know her fight well. She essentially has one small opening after each of her combos, which means you're just going to spend the fight back rolling everything until you get your opening. I found myself dodging away after each of these small openings in an effort to avoid her near-instant proximity punishes. However, if she were to do Millennia's dashing away move before entering a combo, your back roll will be cucked by the camera and send you directly into her combo. This reduces your openings even further unless you're capable of eating her quick punishes, which again feels super sloppy. After learning this fight, it reduces to back rolling, then waiting out her combos, then hitting her for a small amount of damage, especially considering your lack of Erdtree fragments at that point. Parrying helps to supplement your openings, but at the end of the day, Rilana is a mostly simple endurance match. And I'm not saying that she's a bad fight at all, she's just clearly what should have been a mini-boss. I mean, let's just look at the facts here. She's a very simple knight enemy with two very simple swords. She has no speaking lines, no cutscenes, no face, and essentially amounts to a horseless Loretta with a less specialized weapon. And if it weren't for her moon move, you would assume that she's Karian related, but you would never guess that she's Renala's sister. And you might be thinking that her weapons are more than just simple. The 2 Ashes of War she can utilize make her much more than just a mini-boss. Well, to that I would counter with the Godskin Apostle's Black Flame Tornado, the Bell-Bearing Hunter's Mariah's Executioner Sword combo, and the Crucible Knight's various aspect of the Crucible abilities. Rilana would have worked well as several mini-bosses scattered throughout the DLC, but as a difficult remembrance fight, she's just exhausting, and I like her less and less the more I fight her. And I feel like I should mention how boring her boss arena and legacy dungeon is. Her whole castle feels a lot less like a castle and a lot more like a single wall keeping you from ultis. And her boss arena has very little personality. It's cool that it's open to the sky so she can see the moon or whatever, if the Shadow Realm even has a moon. And I like that rain can come down in the middle of fighting her, but let's just call a duck here. It's just a square courtyard. Moving on, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion gets a cutscene and feels a bit more like a real remembrance fight. A shitty remembrance fight, but a remembrance fight nonetheless. It is ironic though that there is a mini-boss version of it placed in the ruins of Rulk or whatever. The major failure of this boss is that it has no limbs or weapons, and so telegraphs are absolutely going to feel unnatural. And learning this boss will feel very frustrating. The difference between a movement and an attack will largely be arbitrary for a while until you get a real grasp on the fight. And then you hit phase 2 and the boss will entirely rely on AoEs for difficulty. Much like Redon, each of the lion's moves will get an additional attack thrown in based on the weather variant the lion has at the time. And this functions great if your vision of design was to make this fight as unengaging as possible. You'll spend most of this fight running away from attacks so as to separate yourself from the secondary effects as much as possible, which again results in the sprint jump method rearing its boring head. And this leaves the arena to be far too small for a fight like this, which again is just a boring box arena with no personality. You'll often barely avoid an attack by the skin of your teeth, only to be pressed against the arena wall, screwing your camera and obscuring the telegraph of the next move. This fight is actual garbage, and I'd be surprised to hear anyone say a single good thing about it, aside from aesthetics. Next, let's take apart Commander Gaius, which should be pretty easy considering everyone pretty much hates him. The obvious criticism is his charge attack, which has a ridiculously small window of error if you're dodging through it. Can be sprint jumped away from, but often comes at you with little warning and therefore little opportunity to respond, and offers no engaging gameplay after successfully avoiding. I would say the same of his phase 2 intro move, which triggers a big gravity AoE, which is reused by Redon, and his gravity thrust, and to an extent his gravitational missile, all of which will cause a considerable amount of disengagement in the fight and offer nothing in return. This was the only fight I found it necessary to use Bloodhound's Step on, which dramatically increased my odds against his charge attack, which you'll see about 25 times a fight. Yeah, this fight is pretty strange, and it doesn't really seem to fit in anywhere except the lore. He's a commander, but he doesn't command anyone. He's guarding this backyard area of the castle, but it doesn't lead anywhere. You just get 5 Skadu fragments and a talisman. His remembrance weapon is a regular smithing stone weapon with a slotted and unslottable Ash of War, which I find pretty cool, but it is definitely strange. Also, he doesn't get his own OST, instead sharing the same battle music as Commander Niall and O'Neill. I really think that this fight should have been blocking off the hinterlands area instead of the secret emote path, which would have given it some value, but as it stands, it's just a bad optional fight with bad rewards. And again, if this dude was a better fight, he could have been made into a mini-boss like the other commanders, rather than arbitrarily making him a remembrance. Now, let's take a bit of a sharp turn here and talk about Romano's Saint of the Bud. I think this fight is really well designed for the most part, and stands out as one of the lesser remembrances in being a decent fight. Could she have worked as a mini-boss? Yeah, definitely. I think she could have been like the Crucible Knights, with small differences in character models and moveset or weapons, which would make the Centaur Scorpipede ladies an elite faction of their own, with each member acting as an individual boss. I don't think she quite meets the mark of a remembrance boss, but that's mostly due to aesthetic reasons, those mainly being no speaking lines, no cutscene, square arena. And speaking of aesthetics, I'm not a big fan of the pastel coloring on her. I think the rebranding of Scarlet Rot in this bright neon color is a strange choice, and I think this boss would work much better if she were closer to a blood red color, which would give her a more grotesque, horrifying design. Like, you wouldn't be sure if she was born with her bug features or if there's some kind of gory symbiotic parasite bursting from her lower half. Instead, she kind of just looks like an edgy My Little Pony OC and doesn't really fit in well with the rest of the game, especially when picturing her in the base game. Her fight is pretty good though. Next we have the Erdtree avatar, which is one of the coolest looking bosses in all of Soulsborne. I don't mind this fight at all, even with the weird respawn 3 times mechanic. It seems pretty comparable to an Erdtree avatar or ulcerated tree spirit, and after fighting more than a single of the Mesmer furnace golem enemies, I really wish the Erdtree avatar would replace them entirely. Fighting the fire baskets is so unbearably tedious and easy, and the other armored variants I was never able to kill because I never found enough hefty pots. Had they replaced them with the Erdtree avatar, they could have even reused the respawn mechanic, making it so that every fight is with the same avatar, which regrows at various locations until you've taken them all out and you get the final kill, dropping its weapon. Yet again, I don't think this boss meets the mark of a remembrance fight, and would have been more valuable as a mini-boss reused at various points in the DLC. And I'm gonna say the same thing about the Putrescent Knight and Midra. Putrescent really feels like it should have been a field boss in at least one point in the game, specifically because of its Phase 2 intro move, which features tracking waves of ice fire that come at you in 3 bursts, with the last being a double wave. This attack is incredibly hard to dodge even when Bloodhound's Step is implemented, however is much easier to avoid by sprint jumping over. And due to that, it feels like a shame that Torrent isn't available for this fight. I don't believe that using Torrent for the entire fight would be all that much help to you, but specifically within this move, it would have been a nice touch to experiment with the mount, and it would certainly add value to the fight if it were a mini-boss in at least 2 separate areas. Perhaps one with Torrent available and one without, in the same way that there are 2 Draconic Tree Sentinels in the base game, 1 field boss, and an optional one in Farum Azula. This pretty much stands for all of these lesser remembrance fights, but forcing them into more important positions than they actually fit into has ironically reduced their value as an asset. It obviously could vary from boss to boss, but I would argue that, say, 2 or more lesser but casual mini-boss fights offer much more gameplay than one fight that's forced to be difficult through high health and damage. FromSoft could have duplicated these fights into 2 or 3 mini-bosses, then divided the remembrance loot amongst them, which would easily fill up the map with valuable boss fights. Instead, the map feels largely empty except for furnace golems, base game mini-bosses or reskins, and mausoleums which only feature PvP style fights. Now, I don't like PvP style fights at all, and would rather skip them if that's an option. So luckily for me, I had a leveled Sacred Relic sword at my disposal. This weapon can easily clear every single one of these mausoleum fights due to their PvP design, even the notoriously difficult first battle with the Black Gale Knight. It is however very disappointing that, to me, these world set pieces all contain a fight worth cheesing, and the question becomes, where are all the mini-bosses in this DLC? You have a couple in a few minor dungeons on the map, including the new Death Knight and the hunched over dude with the circle blades. And then you have other minor dungeons like the Lamenters and Dragon Dungeon, which also just have PvP style fights. And the answer really is, all of the true mini-bosses and field bosses have been arbitrarily turned into remembrance fights for some reason. The last example of this is a Midra, who at very least features a cutscene and dialogue. It's just his combat and legacy dungeon that falls short. Firstly, you have his mansion, which consists of like 6 total rooms that you'll traverse in a linear path until reaching his boss room, which again is just a square room. Like, I get that this dude has a spear running through his body, and probably doesn't need much in the way of furnishing, but what even is this room to him? A throne room without a throne? A bedroom without a bed? I get that it's kind of a nitpick, but a boss room can give so much personality to a boss, and most of these DLC remembrance fights just end up in a nondescript empty room. Anyway, Midra has like 3 basic melee combos and a handful of special moves, and I don't really think that it was necessary to make him a Lord of Frenzied Flame. Vike couldn't even manage to become that, and he was embraced by the 3 Fingers himself. Midra just rips his head off and gets to be a Lord of Frenzied Flame. It just seems kinda off to me. He really should have just been a frenzied victim of the Inquisitors and acted as a mini-boss punctuating this bare-bones area of the map. Now that covers Redon and every boss that I don't believe deserves the title of Remembrance Boss, even if some of them are pretty good bosses. Next there's Metyr, Mother of Fingers. I don't see this boss as hard, it's just really awkward. The most difficult part of its design is the proximity punish you'll have to deal with after attacking an opening, of which there are many with many different timings, including a 2-hit combo that hits faster than you can roll and will punish you for being too greedy. This boss reminds me a lot of Ebritas, Daughter of the Cosmos from Bloodborne, especially within this move, which flings goo everywhere followed by a jump slam. This move is very reminiscent of Ebritas' charge move and requires some very specific positioning and timing to avoid entirely. The goo projectiles will land in a circle around Metyr, around the same time that you'll have to prepare for the slam of the attack. The answer that I found was to first dodge underneath the boss, finding safety from the projectiles, and then dodge out to the side, making enough distance to avoid the slam. This again is super awkward, and you'll often get hit and be confused as to which bit of the attack actually hit you. Not the worst boss in the world, but definitely not my favorite. Now lastly, I have the 2 fights that I think are actually great in their own ways. First there's Bale, which I consider to be the ultimate dragon fight by a wide margin, often charging you with something the moment you enter his arena, and his openings are fairly small, considering you'll have to attempt to position yourself near his head, often involving sprinting or jumping towards him during valuable opening time, which makes ranged Ashes of War very useful to supplement positioning and camera issues. I think his over-the-top AoE design is pretty standard for an endgame dragon fight and fits nicely even when cranked up to the intensity that it is. I like Bale a lot, even despite the few flaws I find in his fight. The first being his straight fire attack, which seems to have some degree of physics to it, like most flame attacks in Elden Ring. The fire is attempting to find a straight path against the ground rather than just being a column of damage, which makes any bumps in the terrain send the fire slightly askew. This wouldn't be a problem if the DLC wasn't so infatuated with the idea of being super difficult. This straight fire attack is the least forgiving of any dragon straight fire that I've ever seen, and it requires decisive quick action or preventative action to avoid somewhat consistently. However, at times, there is nothing you can do if the fire's physics give you bad RNG. Your best bet is to once again begin sprinting and then jump as soon as the fire gets near you, pushing your hitbox as far away as you can manage. The other issue I find in him is once again the dogshit camera in this DLC. The way the fight is designed, you are supposed to be targeting Bale's head, being that his head takes more damage and is the center of most of his openings and where the lock-on point is designated. However, Bale being as aggressive as he is, he will often attack shortly after your openings and push his head past the point where your roll took place, which spins the camera all around and gives you very little control over your positioning. It's really embarrassing to have to mention that so many times at this point in FromSoft's life. I expect much better than basic functions like the camera failing on every single fight in a modern FromSoft project. Other than that, Bale is pretty sick. It is funny, however, that Bale is technically not a Remembrance fight. All of these half-assed bosses get to claim the title of Remembrance fight so far in the DLC, yet Bale just drops his heart, which does function like a Remembrance fight at the Dragon Communion, so it basically counts. The final great fight in this DLC is thankfully Mesmer. and I understand why they put him front and center in marketing. His moveset is fast, aggressive, and sometimes tricky, with a huge delay on his grab and several different flame-charged spear moves with subtly different telegraphs. I think his weakest aspect is his Phase 2, which relies far too much on him activating Serpent form, which creates a much more scripted set-piece fight. But this is only a small piece of the fight, as he'll use most of the same moves in Phase 2 as well. My only complaint with this boss is that it isn't hard enough to fully express his moveset. And this could only be relevant to me because I had collected a bunch of Scadu fragments at that point, and I was dealing some pretty significant damage. However, I wouldn't be complaining if he had a full health bar Phase 2 and was more in line with Millennia. I think his place as a mid-difficult boss fight as far as the DLC goes is because he is directly preventing players from progressing in the DLC. But that's really a shame because his fight is many times more finely tuned and well crafted than the garbage fight he's blocking access to. I really wish that Mesmer was the true final boss of this DLC and had the difficulty reflect that, because as it stands, he's one of the only good fights in the whole DLC. And so to summarize, this whole DLC is filled to the brim with artificial difficulty due to pumping the health and damage of what should otherwise be mini-bosses, and by reducing the leeway you might have on bosses' attacks by making attacks that take up nearly the entirety of your iframes within a roll. This obsession with a single quality of Elden Ring's base game design has come at the cost of so many other crucial, exemplary design choices which have been damaged significantly in this content, such as reducing the value of a jumpable move from a high skill option that allows you to stay engaged while avoiding a boss's attack, and turning it into the only means of avoiding a contrived barrage of nonsense that forces you to disengage at best. And that's really the best way to describe the difficulty of this DLC. It's contrived. If you're really telling me that the only way you could make a hard final boss was to implement an undodgeable move and by filling the arena with holy projectiles, then you shouldn't be making boss fights anymore. A great boss fight should look like a duel between two warriors, and should make you feel like you're dancing in between the boss's attacks, not jamming yourself into the dude's nutsack because the twink on his back is trying to hit you with the power of Christ. Lothric and Lorien did this shit 1,000 times better, without contrived difficulty. I don't even really like that fight. I hate teleporting bosses. However, it is undeniably a better and more interesting design choice to make each brother have their own health bar, with the Necromancer being your main target. The skill set of positioning is naturally developed within that fight because you'll get much more value from attacking Lorien directly, rather than an absolutely contrived line of holy projectiles falling after each attack. And so, with difficulty out of the way, let's move on to exploration. I think at this point I've let slip enough how I'm feeling about this content that you should probably guess where I'm going with this. The world bosses are mostly reused bosses from the main game or reskins. The worst example of this is probably the Hinterlands, which greets you with a Tree Sentinel, followed by a Tree Sentinel, followed by a Falling Star Beast. The funny thing about the Tree Sentinels being reused here is that we already have every piece of the Tree Sentinel's kit unlocked in the main game except for his horse, and so the reward for these fights are 2 bottles of Marika Bathwater, a reskin of the Divine Blessing from Dark Souls. The rest of the new mini-bosses are going to be found in minor dungeons, of which there are only 11 in the whole DLC. However, the new category of Forge minor dungeons don't even have a boss fight. They have a weapon to pull out of a forge as a main reward. The new bosses throughout the rest of the minor dungeons include Death Knights, Demi-Human Swordmasters, Chief Bloodfiend, a Curse Blade, and Inquisitor Jory. As well as that, there's the 2 new forms made into PvP-style boss fights with the Lamenter and the Dragon Man. It is wholly clear to me that boss fights were not being prioritized when creating the exploratory content of this DLC, and that feels like such a fucking misread of what Elden Ring is supposed to be. Pulling some random weapon out of a forge is unfathomably less satisfying than it dropping as a reward from a boss fight, even if that boss fight isn't the best fight in the game. I find it baffling that loot was prioritized over gameplay in the explorative content, and especially so when considering that you're basically guaranteed to enter the DLC with a fully built character. It would be one thing if you could spawn in the DLC on a fresh new game, which would make every piece of loot that much more valuable to you. However, with a full kit, every loot drop either exists as something starkly powerful, enough so that you'll go out of your way to implement it into your rotation of weapons, or it's just garbage that you'll never equip. It would be kinda like if the main game's character select screen included fully leveled characters, such as the Azure Comet build, dual Katana Bleed build, full heavy armor Great Shield build, and so on. Why would you feel the need to explore if most of what you're going to loot is much worse than what you already have? And the DLC is structured even worse than that because most of us were going in with characters we've played the entire game with, and therefore collected almost all the items. So the DLC's world is fleshed out with a bunch of loot I don't care about except for a few things, a bunch of crafting materials, a bunch of crafting books, and very few bosses, almost none of which are new. How the fuck am I supposed to feel inclined to explore this world? FromSoft's answer to the predicament of attempting to simulate a level of progression tied to your exploration of this world was the implementation of the Erdtree fragments, which are infinitely less immersive than the main game's massive list of loot, levels, NPCs, and challenges to overcome, all of which contribute to an increase in your overall power and abilities. Instead of, say, finding powerful talismans that can increase your damage by X amount in specific scenarios, you just gather a bunch of these pieces of bark, and you're permanently more powerful. Instead of finding a powerful weapon, collecting the resources to upgrade it, and gathering runes to meet its stat requirements, you just find bark, and then eat it, I guess. It's really entirely nebulous because it's a game mechanic first and foremost and not a real part of this world. Reduce every rewarding and immersive aspect of adventuring and exploring into a single item you'll have to hunt down throughout the whole map, and your result is a massive map that feels like an obligation to explore, rather than inspiring you to adventure through it with natural excitement. For me, this expansion felt a lot like a checklist of areas to clear for the sake of having appropriate damage on bosses, and that's such a fucking sad statement to make about Elden Ring's content. And what's even more sad is to realize what a relief it is that you'll keep the Erdtree fragments you've collected when you go into New Game Plus, which brings me to my next point. After starting a New Game Plus and approaching the DLC with a fully leveled Bark Blessing character, you're given the unique position of insight to decide exactly which parts of the Realm of Shadow you'll replay purely for the experience itself. You'll have nothing really to gain at that point, having looted everything of value and having reached the power caps of full Erdtree fragments and level hard caps, and you'll have the opportunity to see exactly how much of the content is worth actually playing. And so let's take a look at this massive map and dissect it a bit. And keep in mind I'll be looking at this through a subjective lens to describe how I feel about this content. First of all, we can completely cross out both the blue and red flower areas in the southern sections of the map. I really don't feel all that inclined to go well out of my way to fight the putrescent knight, and both of these sections are filled with reskin base game bosses. I can say the exact same thing about the Jagged Peak, which features 2 Drake fights and an Ancient Dragon fight. This leaves the peak as a single linear path to sprint through as fast as possible to get to Bale, one of the few decent fights that I would probably go out of my way to do. From the starting area, we have the Bellarat Tower, a half-decent legacy dungeon with one of the worst bosses in all of Elden Ring at its end, an easy skip. Well then, we can take on Castle Ensis instead, a tiny legacy dungeon with a single linear path ending in the Relana fight. As I've said, I get pretty bored of this boss's moveset by the end of her fight, so more often than not, I'll just skip the dungeon and go around the side area. From here, we can either enter the Shadow Keep from the front or side, and if we choose the front, we're greeted by the Golden Hippo fight. This is an obnoxious mini-boss whose grab hitbox was just nerfed and entirely relies on the same style of difficulty as the Dancing Lion fight. It only attacks with its head and therefore has unnatural telegraphs that are difficult to distinguish from basic movements. And then you hit phase 2, where you'll be pelted by an unnecessary amount of projectiles on each of its special moves. This fight is an easy pass, so we'll head through the side path, which first will bring us near the Manus Cathedral, which sends us along the quest toward Metir. This quest only features visits to 2 incredibly massive yet incomprehensibly useless areas of the map. Both of the Finger Ruins are worthless wastes of assets and only offer you a source of crafting material for items you'll never craft, and are the only areas featuring the lamprey enemies. These dudes feel so out of place here and don't really have any other presence in the rest of the DLC, in the lore, or in Elden Ring at all. Overall, this whole quest is just to fight Metir, a fight that wasn't too bad, but I doubt I would go out of my way for. And so let's just cross out both of the Finger Ruins as well as the Hinterland section leading up to the second ruins, which only features base game bosses. Next we'll enter the Church District in an effort to get to the Shadow Keep, but be met with the decision of whether or not we'll want to fight the Scadutree avatar. And I think this one is a big toss-up. This fight is pretty mid as far as the fight itself goes, and I think the fact that I would only go out of my way to fight it out of respect for its aesthetics kinda says it all. The combat is pretty basic and often disrupted by event moves or the boss respawning, and the boss isn't blocking anything. The sad thing is, I don't even dislike this fight at all. I just absolutely wouldn't go out of my way to fight it. If it was instead several world bosses, I would likely never skip one directly in my path. This is a huge issue of implementation that I've been referencing throughout this video. The boss's potential is wasted where it is, and so I'll regrettably say that I would skip this fight, just as I would Relana. Commander Gaius is an easy skip, and I won't go into details on that one. But what about Midra? Obviously a skip, but let's talk about why. Because this is one of the most egregious waste of assets across the whole DLC. The process of reaching Midra requires finding a hidden coffin in the Shadow Keep, riding it into the moat drainage area, which features several furnace golems, easy skip, one of which you can apparently ignite by throwing a heavy flame pot into its head, but I never got it to work. Then you follow a ravine down a cliff and eventually into a minor dungeon, which features several lighting puzzles, a giant mouth imp, 3 different floors, and ends in a gank fight, which rivals the Godskin duo in terms of gankiness and unsatisfying gameplay. After overcoming the dungeon, you're free to enter the Abyssal Woods, a frenzy-flamed themed area that just ends up looking like a Spirit Halloween store. Lo and behold, Torrent is too scared to be summoned within this area. Now forget the fact that Torrent has been our unwavering, faithful steed throughout swamps of rot, in fights with dragons of all kinds, and unfazed by the battle with Redon. He's too scared of frenzy? Like madness buildup? Doesn't really make sense considering he's immune, so I guess he's afraid of the spooky Halloween woods. That's fucking weird. What's even weirder is the many developer messages written throughout this area, which really makes this content feel like a Roblox or Overwatch custom game, where the rules have to be written for you because it's not something you would expect out of the base game, such as the stealth minigame you're forced into with the reintroduction of winter lanterns. Now I would absolutely have no problem with these enemies if they could be implemented in a natural, immersive way, but I think the messages on the ground here pretty much speak for themselves. This content is strange and disjointed from the main game in such a jarring way. We're forced off our mounts due to contrivance and then funneled into these enemies that only amount to crouching for a while or parrying each one of them. What the fuck is this entire area? The woods section is massive, bare bones, and empty, with random pointless pieces of loot thrown in that are never worth the run back. And 3 total enemies, rats, inquisitors, and winter lanterns. This whole woods area should have been considered part of the legacy dungeon, and therefore should have had an interesting layout with twists and turns that take you through the many different set pieces that mesh well together. Instead, we get a giant lump of spooky themed nothing, and the cherry on top, you'll have to walk through it on foot. And after a secret coffin shortcut, a ravine path, a large minor dungeon, and a 5k through the woods, we still haven't reached the legacy dungeon. Midra's Manse is embarrassingly small, and only amounts to a linear path you'll sprint through while periodically pulling levers. And even on your first playthrough here, you'll find very little of value to you. The majority of items here are frenzied flame related, one of the worst status effects. Even if Midra was the greatest fight in the DLC, getting to him would be a pain in the ass, on a similar level to reaching Millennia. But the fact is, he's not named Midra for nothing. He's a glorified mini-boss and the easiest skip so far. And that leaves us with the final stretch of the main playthrough of the DLC. Mesmer is incredible, and I might have to fight him on a higher new game or lower level so as to avoid breezing through him the next time I fight him. Redon is an obvious pass, so we'll cross out Inner Ilum, and if there's no progression-based rewards for beating Romana, then I'll once again regrettably pass on her too. Getting to her requires navigating through the Shadow Keep and past the Pyromancer's Bridge, only to end up in the confusing, convoluted ruins area. Sadly, it's a pass. And so what am I left with on a replay of this content? A straight shot through to Bale and then Mesmer, and that's it. To me, everything else isn't worth my time on a casual New Game Plus playthrough. and that is a tragedy. All of this leaves me with a single conclusion about the contents in Shadow of the Erdtree, a useless conclusion that doesn't change anything. Shadow of the Erdtree should have been a sequel, not a DLC. Of course, this would require several more years of development to extend the map, flesh out what we have, and find appropriate places to reuse assets instead of sequestering half-assed fights into the role of remembrance. But just look at what the content of this DLC was focused on. Innovating the weapon system by adding new types of weapons. Innovating the difficulty by making boss moves less forgiving, innovating the combat by adding the deflection tier and backstep iframes through new talismans. Innovation is the exact quality that you would expect from a sequel, which would tread the lines between offering something new while not getting too far away from what worked in the first place. Refinement is what you would want and expect from a DLC, which is a concept that this content is sorely lacking in. You already have the road paved, the weapons designed, the combat ironed out, the world built, the basic systems in place like bonfires, weapon upgrades, leveling, consumables. When making a DLC, all you have to do is create the most refined concept of content that you can within the game you've already built. Not throw a bunch of new, weird, half-baked ideas that may or may not jive with the rest of the base game concepts. This content is 100% focused on innovation despite still being attached to Elden Ring. And now the base game's content's meta is getting brutalized by a barrage of innovations that it wasn't built to facilitate. On top of that, the DLC's content is also hurt by being attached to Elden Ring for some obvious reasons. If you wish to play the DLC content again, even if you use a New Game Plus and don't have to hunt for weapons or upgrades, it takes around 40 minutes at best to complete the intro, get your horse, get to Altus, get to Caelid, beat Redon, start Vare's quest, get to the Belfry, soak your sheet in Maiden's Blood, return to Vare, kill the invader in Altus, get your ride to Mogwyn, complete Mogwyn, and beat Mohg. All of that just to enter this massive world, only to realize there's very little replayability in this massive world. So you'll do 2 fights and then leave. If this content wasn't piggybacking off of Elden Ring's base game and was a standalone sequel, you could instead start as a level 1 in Mogwyn's Palace, beat some new intro boss in Mohg's Arena, and then be off into the DLC. You would have a fresh start and everything would be valuable to you, including the many weapons, rune drops, upgrade materials, every crafting book, and resource. It would be just like Elden Ring's original release, and therefore you wouldn't need the contrived and largely disliked Erdtree fragment system of progression. The various challenges throughout this world could have been balanced to the level you would be expected to fight them at, which would create a natural scale of progression, again just like the main game. Lastly, killing Mohg and Redon were made to be mandatory events that you must complete before gaining access to the DLC, so that their stories could be chronologically accurate. This leads the DLC to be placed in a very inconvenient near endgame position, and with that in mind, I think it's clear but frustrating as to why we didn't get a single drop of Melina or Godwyn lore in this content. For Melina's story to be progressed, this would require first burning the Erdtree, in order to keep a chronologically accurate depiction of events in Shadow of the Erdtree. This would also disqualify anyone who was playing a Lord of Frenzied Flame playthrough, as the events would then play out differently. In the same way, if Godwyn were to appear in a meaningful way in the DLC, you would likely have to play through Fia's questline first. And so, FromSoft seems to have been in the position where they could either have a fully fleshed out DLC that tackles many players in this world but requires beating most of the content in the base game, or cutting everyone less important to the single main storyline of the DLC so that only Redon and Mohg had to be beaten. And at some fucking point, someone should have said, if the continuation of this story requires taking place after the events of most of the main game, then why don't we just do that and make a full sequel? At some point, someone should have said, if we're making a giant massive map which we'll need to fill with meaningful loot, then why don't we delay it and make it a full sequel? Someone should have said, if we're making all kinds of new weapon classes, implementing Sekiro deflections and iframe backsteps, why don't we fine-tune the combat engine a bit and just make a fucking sequel? This is a tragedy every way you look at it, because the amount of content is huge for a DLC, one of the biggest content drops in gaming history. Yet I would describe it as mostly half-baked. This is way more than $40 worth of ingredients, but it was served to us fucking raw. And I think the saddest part of all of this is that this might be the very last bit of Elden Ring content that we will ever see. There are rumors going around that FromSoft won't be working on projects as large scale as Elden Ring in the future. And the fact that this content has mixed reviews on Steam might be the nail in the coffin. So many people put so much time into creating the Shadow of the Erdtree, and I for one would easily give it a negative review, and that is by no means the fault of the project's scale or the ground level developers breaking their backs to build the many pieces that came together to create this world. I 100% place the blame on a lack of direction and vision. If you think undodgeable boss moves are good enough, you shouldn't be making bosses. If you think that Erdtree fragments are good enough to replace every system of progression in the main game, you shouldn't be designing balancing systems. If you think that an environment unfriendly towards casuals is an appropriate setting for your fucking Elden Ring content, then you don't understand your own fanbase. Above all else, if you fail to recognize that this content sucks as a DLC and yet has all the potential in the world as a sequel, then you shouldn't have been a creative director on this project. And that failure has led to countless hours of effort and development to amount to nothing but a mixed review on Steam. A rating that I would argue is too high and is largely propped up by mindless get-good drones who choose to be ignorant to the failures of this content. This content drop was easily a worst-case scenario for Elden Ring fans. We didn't and will never get a true DLC that refines what worked about Elden Ring to its most perfected form, and we will likely never get a sequel, as all of the remaining lore has been pilfered through for its most important parts, leaving Millennia, Godwyn, the Glowmide Queen, and every other unanswered question on the cutting room floor. This is it. And if that statement doesn't leave a depressed pit in your stomach, then I envy you. So how did this happen? How did one of the industry-leading developers with one of the most popular games of the last decade fumble this hard at such an important juncture? I don't really have an answer for you. All I can do is speculate, and my speculation comes down to two options. The first scenario asks the question, is there a B-team narrative to be made here? For those of you who don't know, when Dark Souls 2 was first seen in a critical light, many people placed the blame on a change of director, being that Miyazaki was at the time working on Bloodborne. And this led to the general idea that Miyazaki had brought FromSoft's A-team with him, leaving the development of DS2 in the hands of a new director and a so-called B-team. Now, it has been widely reported that FromSoft has gone through a large growth in team members following the success of Elden Ring, and that they had begun working on several projects at once. The assumption being that they would be working on FromSoft's lesser projects like Armored Core, which would fund more important projects such as Shadow of the Erdtree. Lord knows I only purchased Armored Core as a way of paying back all the great times I had in Elden Ring, which vastly exceeded its price tag. One thing I consistently mentioned while playing through Armored Core is that it looked like it was easy to make, which I for one saw as a good thing, being that it meant more time was likely being spent on Shadow of the Erdtree. Unfortunately, it seems to me that some of this new B team could have likely also been put in charge in design elements of Elden Ring's DLC, and that some of these team members might have been members of the Souls modding community, which would certainly explain some of the lesser aspects of Redon's and many other boss fight designs. You know, the boss's moves that are a smattering of several copy-pasted projectile pieces coming at you, arbitrarily forcing you to avoid them in an over-the-top contrived way. And you know, at a certain point, even a non-gank fight starts to feel just as shitty as a gank fight when there are multiple independent pieces of attack to avoid at once. It all kind of ends the same way, with you sprinting around the arena, dodging a few bits of overreaching attack while disengaged from the rest entirely. At very least, every fight ends up feeling like a mage fight, and none of that should be praised as high-level, quality, difficult boss design. Now, I know that the B-team narrative is largely disliked, I imagine because it doesn't really help things and there's no real way to prove who worked on what exactly, especially considering the fact that Shadow of the Erdtree has no official credits, which is convenient to say the least. But just ask yourself this, do you really think in your heart of hearts that the people who designed Margit, Real Redon, Rykard, Morgott, Malekith, Moog, Horlu, Stormvale Castle, Caelid, Liurnia of the Lakes, the Erdtree, Altus Plateau, the Alexander the Warrior Jar questline, and everything else that you would see in that one Elden Ring edit are the same people who designed Pontiff on HRT, Buggier Qualag, DS1 Fanged Boar found a rider, Orphan of Kos found a horsey, literally just Ebritas, Madir after a bulk, Shadows of Yharnam Phase 3 but done right this time, and, I don't know, let's mix things up. What about a couple of brothers who are challenging the ways of old, one of who resurrects the larger strength-built other, and then proceeds to hang around his neck casting holy magic in Phase 2. Redon and Mikola, yeah, I was totally describing them. References are one thing, but there is a distinct lack of creativity across the board within this content, and it largely feels like it was made by fans instead of competent, well-seasoned developers. The only other potential explanation I could come up with is purely that it's a money thing. Elden Ring is a massive success with millions of players, and yet that was one single purchase 2.5 years ago. And it's a game that's competing with other games in the industry developed by blood-sucking companies like Bungie, who charge $100 for what's supposed to be a year's worth of content that I only ended up playing for 2 days. And then they harp on you to buy microtransactions and shop in their merch store. It must be frustrating to see others in your industry who offer nothing yet make money hand over fist, when you're creating the type of game that I've personally played for over 1,300 hours and only paid $100 total for. And I do wonder if Armored Core has played any part in that. Armored Core, as I said, looks like it was made with very little effort, looking a lot like those 360 demos you would play in Walmart in the early 2000s. That never bothered me because I didn't purchase the game to actually play it. I was voting with my wallet to fund FromSoft. However, it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever if some business-minded dumbass somewhere high up in FromSoft saw the numbers and the profit created from such a simple game and thought it would be a good idea to invest in games like that. If we see a fucking Ninja Blade reboot trailer next, I might actually throw up. Armored Core sold 2.8 million copies in 3 months. It was definitely a golden egg. But only a moron would fail to realize that Elden Ring was the fucking goose. If FromSoft stops creating games like Elden Ring that take a lot of time and effort but are beloved by almost everyone who tries them, then I don't know what to say. They're fucking cooked. And if From does end up falling off, then know that Shadow of the Erdtree was the tipping point. The moment they sold out. I really hope I'm wrong about this. Trust me, I'm the last person I thought would be disappointed by this content. But let's end this on a positive note. Instead of moping about what was, let's think about how we can course correct. First of all, I would urge From not to give up on large-scale projects. I mean, if they ever got the rights to Bloodborne and made a sequel on the scale of Elden Ring, they would be fucking printing moolah. And so the question remains, with hindsight at our disposal, how do you make a DLC for a game like Elden Ring? And this is where we meet at a compromise. I make this proposition. If FromSoft is willing to put forth the effort to create incredible large-scale worlds like Elden Ring, then I, and I believe many of you as well, would be willing to purchase many expensive small-scale DLCs that expand the map in small areas at various points. This would fund their further projects, allowing fans to show their appreciation and keep the game relevant for extended periods of time. On top of that, the content would flesh out the more bare-bones areas of the game and offer much more synergy than a single large lump of content after beating Moog. For example, take the Jagged Peak and place it directly after the capital, perhaps offering an additional route to the mountaintop of the giants. Replace one of the Jagged Peak drakes with a Ghost Flame Dragon, and I would easily have paid $20 for that without hesitation. And it would have came out within like 2 months of the game's release. That covers half the cost of a DLC that came out after 2.5 years and has mixed reviews. With this model, from that point forward, every playthrough of Elden Ring would include Bale. including your next playthrough that takes you through the next DLC drop, which might drop the Shadowkeep and Mesmer below the Volcano Manor or something. There would be an ebb and flow to the content's release, which would each fund FromSoft with a steady income and each bolster the game as a whole, rather than one content drop 2 years later, which will largely be forgotten in 2 months. And I know that content price is a touchy subject, and that many people wouldn't be willing to pay for expensive content, but I would argue that those people just don't care about the content enough, I guess. Like, you could also wait until they release a Elden Ring Complete Edition later on. That would be cheaper, because I would much rather pay more for FromSoft to continue making incredible content rather than see them release content in this sorry state of affairs. At the end of the day, if Elden Ring was never a financially viable product, if it took too much out of the development team to create and doesn't offer them enough in return to compensate that, then all we can really do is take Elden Ring for what it was. And that was a gift. It was such an exciting, challenging, beautiful, charming, somber, and uplifting adventure. It gave me so much hope for the future. And I'm not ready to give up that hope yet. I cannot wait to see what FromSoft does next, because I'm a sucker for a redemption arc, and I really hope that this content's failures were the cost of their next project's success. The last thing I want to do in this video is take a look at the last aspect I expected out of a FromSoft DLC. Incredible lore, and they did not disappoint. I mean, you could argue that this was already written and developed 2 years ago, and therefore nobody who worked on Shadow of the Erdtree actually created any of the lore, but that's neither here nor there. Miquella's story is fucking wild, encompassing the very first moments of the first Elden Ring trailer, being the moment that Millennia whispered into Redon's ear as her Ionia blossoms. Sure, I first thought this moment was pillow talk in a metaphor for Redon and Millennia having incest sex, which I described in my last large Elden Ring video. Sorry everyone, I was way off. Miquella, his brother, was hitting that, and needed Millennia to take him out for that process to be facilitated. I love the fact that Mohg's body was used in the process of resurrecting Redon, which further sees to his mistreatment. I love that Mohg, the seemingly most evil character in the lore, was redeemed, having been under Miquella's spell from the beginning. It's all great, but there was one bit of content lore-wise that was my favorite moment in all of the DLC. I'm just gonna play it for you rather than trying to describe it, and that will be my outro to this video. Do, however, pay attention to when the music changes from the knockoff God of War theme to something else here. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And I hope you enjoyed Shadow of the Erdtree far more than I did. Maybe I'm just totally off base here and everyone loved it. Anyway, catch you next time.